Lily Cole, thank you for being here at the United Nations Foundation today. It's an honor to have someone who's helping us to anchor an important conversation, doing something around the world that is as unique and as fresh and as young and as forward-thinking as you. We're grateful to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Lily, many people around the world know you as an activist, as an actress, as a model, and as a voice of a new generation doing some remarkable things. As I've been looking through your background, it's been astounding to look at how much you've been able to do in a few short years. Your young life is a life that accomplished already quite a bit, and it's always been looking at the future. And today we're here at the United Nations Foundation, joined by people who care about global engagement and global issues, which for the UN Foundation is right in the middle of our mission, where we love to connect people and ideas and resources to help the UN solve global problems. And your work around impossible is getting to an important area that not a lot of people have talked about. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about Impossible, this remarkable new platform, and what brought you to found something this extraordinary. Tell us about Impossible, and tell us about the name, because Impossible conjures up an interesting challenge to us. What's Impossible, Lily, and what should we know?
Several questions there. So I'll talk about the name separately, because that's a whole other conversation, but the premise of Impossible is to try and encourage a culture of giving through a social network. And it was an idea that I had with a friend 3 years ago. We were on a plane, and we were talking about the economy, and we were talking, like, it was post-recession. We were talking about why is it that when the economy falters, that society consequently immediately falters. Because if you think about it, there is still the same amount of skills, resources to move around. We've just lost the means to move them. And arguably, with most resources and all skills and services, there's an abundance. And yet we've kind of become trapped almost sometimes in a scarcity model. And we were talking about society that nowadays. I grew up in London for the most part and spent several years in New York, and how these very kind of big metropolitan cities make it almost impossible to know how to move things around and to know what simple needs you might be able to meet with your neighbors or the people around you. And that spawned the idea of, well, what if there was a website or a technical platform that pointed out those possibilities? And it felt like such a simple idea that felt very obvious. And I remember the exact moment I was on a plane, like having that conversation that we kind of struck it. And then I was in university, and so I carried on studying for another 6 months afterwards. And I kept thinking of that and obsessing over it and wondering why something like that not that it didn't exist, but didn't exist at a scale that I knew of it and was using it. And I looked up lots of different examples of people doing things in that space or similar attempts at an idea, kind of not quite the same but similar. And I also happened to discover the gift economy as a concept. A friend of mine that I was doing a play with at the time was an anthropologist in Cambridge, and I'd mentioned the idea to her, and she was like, "Oh yeah, well that's the gift economy. You should read Marcel Mauss's book. He's kind of probably the most famous anthropologist who's written about it." And I was like, "What? There's a word for that? The gift economy? What is that?" And I started reading all these books, and the sociology and the psychology and the science around gift economies and how they, giving creates chemicals that make you happier. It triggers cycles of reciprocity, so it's understood to work, and plenty of examples of pre-capitalist societies that existed solely as gift economies, and many ways that gift economy is a part of our own society nowadays. And the fundamental part of the science that inspired me was that giving creates subtle relationships between the individuals. And so if you imagine that at scale, it's social cohesion and it's community. And I think that's the real essence of what Impossible is striving for. And so I became more and more compelled by wanting to try and realize that idea at scale. And when I graduated, I'd never worked in technology before, and I'd never done a few kind of business things, but not properly in business. I started just talking to people about the idea. And interestingly, every time I would say the idea to somebody, for the most part, they would say, I love that, how can I help you? And after a year of those conversations, I had like quite a big team of people trying to help me realize this idea. And I was like, at one point I was like, well, I can't not do it now because I'm answerable to all these
Put it
people.
out there.
Yeah. Quite amazingly, so it was quite a gift economy, the growth of this platform. And so now, 3 years later, we've actually built a social network, and it's by no means perfect. And this morning I check in and I'm like, okay, I've got to deal with these issues and we can improve this, and I'm sure that's going to be an ongoing process. But I'm really committed to the vision of the idea, and it's been also quite extraordinary to see people's reception to it and people using it, basically.
You said that for a lot of people it seems so obvious that this should exist, and it's something that's so basic for people because people do understand giving. And I want to go back to why it makes people happy, and I'd love to hear and to talk about some stories in that regard. But tell us how it works, because for the people who know that it makes sense, how does Impossible itself actually work, and what is it about Impossible that's going to change my life as someone who's using it, and how is it going to make my tomorrow different?
Well, I guess there's two different things there. One is the idea, which is what I was just talking about, and that I think transcends any website or app, or that hopefully happens all the time without a website app. The point of designing a website and app, which is what we've done with Impossible, is just to try and make possibilities more evident. And so the way that's done is people can post wishes, we call them wishes, because it's hopefully non-expectational, whereby you could say, I would love somebody I'm just thinking of someone I've seen, to help me weed my garden because I've got 2 kids and I can't deal with it, or I would need a haircut, or my bag broke a few weeks ago, so I posted out, I wish if someone has a spare bag nearby that they don't mind getting rid of, like I'd love to have a bag. When I've got rid of things from my house, I've posted them out on Impossible. So it could be products, could be skills, could be services. The only premise is that everything is done for free, and that your reason for doing is also to be part of a community whereby that community will do something back for you. And saying thank you is a currency of sorts within the network. It's a kind of subversion of the idea of currency. It's an abundant currency. It doesn't mean anything on a literal level in terms of I have now 5 thank yous, therefore my wish will be answered. But the fact that I have 5 thank yous or 20 thank yous or 200 thank yous means the community is seeing how generous I am, and there might potentially be some kind of, in the same way that community works, reaction to that.
So Impossible is helping to make easier something that we as human beings like to do or do in general in that sense of community. And your community, your hometown is London, right? That London's the city you would call home even though you're all around the world.
Yeah.
I read that you at a certain point I think you were talking about London, which is probably true of Washington, D.C., where we are today, or anywhere around the world, that in these large metropolitan areas, it's possible that we don't actually know a lot of people or our neighbors. So is that an intentional part of the design of Impossible? Tell us how that works, and have you seen it make a change for people living in those big communities that may seem alone?
That's definitely an intentional part of the design, and I think that the more we get kind of localized, denser groups of communities, the more valuable it'll be, because people won't just then be doing online kind of fulfillment of wishes, but they'd also be able to do offline things, which happens a lot in London, but not so much elsewhere potentially. Yes, so contrary to most social networks that exist now, you don't just see the people you know already, so it's not just your own social graph. You can follow your friends, so you can see your friends' requests, but location is a huge part of it, so you can also filter content that's nearby. And I'd say most interactions that are happening right now are usually strangers, because if you think about it, I would imagine that for the most part, people, when they have a need that they think their friends could ask, I will just email a friend. Whereas when you put it out to a wider net of people, like the people who live around you, you expose yourself to more possibilities, essentially. I saw a girl who I don't know very well, a week ago post that she just wants more female friends because she only knows men. And I actually had met her once for like an hour or half an hour, and she'd never said that. And it's like just giving people the opportunity to open up that need that I could so easily answer. That's, I think, the magic, maybe.
This is so interesting, this idea that by opening up the need and by making the need public, because it takes some courage to do that, to say publicly what you need. I could not have taken care of that need for her, for example. No. But I'm aware that I'm a good friend, though. I think I could be a good friend to anybody. But it makes me aware that some people have those needs, so that I could connect someone like you with someone like her. That's fascinating.
It's really beautiful, actually, and really human, because I can't answer a lot of them. I mean, I'll drive myself mad if I keep trying to, but there's something very touching about just actually seeing what, like things that maybe people you pass in the street and they wouldn't say, the very simple needs sometimes. I think it's a very, very emotional level to it.
Well, then let's get back to the name, because the name is something that immediately caught my imagination when I learned of impossible. And for those of us who follow your work, it seems like there's probably nothing impossible in your life. Again, at this stage in your career, you've done so much, and you have so many titles around your name. So something that is obvious and something that is human and so natural as you've described it, why in the world does it have the name impossible around it? Help us understand.
So a few different reasons. I wrote my thesis in university around the idea of a kind of reclaiming the idea of utopia in the contemporary world, and it was called Impossible Utopias, and it was quite philosophical in its approach, and looked at the idea of possibility and impossibility and parts of it, and the idea that we frame those, the idea of the impossible is largely a human construct. Actually, if you think about science and what this planet, like the miracles that really happen in the way science works. Our idea, like when you overhear somebody in a cafe say something's impossible, it's usually not impossible. It's usually like quite a fictitious limitation or construct. And so I was kind of challenging that, like how we limit ourselves with our own thinking. And when I started working on what's now called Impossible, it wasn't called Impossible, and it wasn't connected to my thesis, although it was, I guess, connected through my thinking on it. But I must have bought maybe 20 different domains and kept coming up with different ideas. And then just one night I was in a taxi going home and I was like, impossible. I was like, it's got to be called impossible because it's utopian. And it's like, it's so easy for people to be cynical and say that's not going to be possible. Like people being kind to each other for no reason, like trying to break that exchange paradigm whereby I do something for you because I expect something in return. And we cross out the I'm and kind of challenge any, the negativity that might preclude an idea like this coming into the world.
What a great misperception to prove wrong every day, that this idea that people are doing this and you're proving it. Let's move from Washington, D.C., where we are today, and we've talked about London, and we've talked about communities where this is happening. I'd like to take us to Bangladesh for a minute, because I know that someone who has been an important inspiration for you, an important inspiration for many people here in the room, and indeed a board member of the UN Foundation, is Professor Mohammed Yunus. How did you take the teachings of Professor Yunus, and how have they informed your thinking and Impossible?
So I feel very fortunate to have met him and to have him as an advisor on Impossible. I met him 2 years ago in Davos. I was there hosting an event for the British government in the pre-Olympic campaign, and I just started working on Impossible. And I met Jimmy Wales as well that day, who's also become heavily involved. And the first question I asked Jimmy was, why did you make Wikipedia a non-profit? Because I was circulating in my mind how I wanted to legally structure Impossible. In thinking about Impossible, in thinking about the gift economy, you inevitably run into critiques of the financial kind of existing economy as it stands right now. And it seemed somewhat paradoxical if I was to frame the gift economy internally in an orthodox business model and personally become very rich off that, potentially. And at the same time, making it a non-profit, I felt like I feel like business and money is so powerful nowadays that wouldn't it be better to have that power and try and do good with it, essentially, if you can idealize something. And so I was having those conversations, and that day somebody said to me, well, you should look at Professor Yunus's social business model, because he's kind of codified a language around trying to meet charity, essentially, and business, the intention of charity with the structure of business. And I met Professor Yunus very briefly, but then I met him again several times that year, and he invited me out to Bangladesh. I went to Bangladesh with him for 5 or 6 days and studied different social businesses that he set up in Bangladesh. Really deeply tried to understand the model and the implications of it, and felt that it was genuinely kind of a powerful model and appropriate for Impossible.
Was
And
that your
so-
first time in Bangladesh when
Yeah.
you were with him? You've been all around the world, and every place is unique, but I'll bet Bangladesh was a special trip as you're studying for Impossible. What did you bring back after Bangladesh and you're kind of with you personally?
I mean, the whole trip was focused around Yunus and Yunus social business. And so my experience of it was very much grounded in that. We went to visit one of the early Grameen banks in the villages. And I mean, it's quite extraordinary to see. You literally go into a small village and there's, a house made of like really like thin like material. That's the bank. That's the assigned bank in the village, which is just, I mean, so contrary to how I understand a bank. But it was symbolic. Like that was the space that village is allowed to go in and trade money, and there's a certain language and rules around it. And you meet the board advisors for the bank, which I did, and I think it's 14, maybe that number's slightly wrong, but 14 women, older village women. And again, it's just so contrary to how I understand that institution. And you're just seeing the effect he's had in that country, and the warmness and the warmth that people have towards him too was a very beautiful thing to see. And then separately, I mean, that's looking at his previous work with Grameen, with the Grameen Bank, but separately studying social business, meeting different people, running social businesses, really trying to think through it like on a kind of political, philosophical level, was a very powerful thing, and I feel very glad I did that trip.
There are people like Professor Yunus who are making pioneering moves in their home countries and around the world. And we're sitting here talking today about an issue that has the potential to really change the world, where there's a generation that's already changing the world. So I'd like to turn our conversation to the young people of today. We talk a lot about the millennial generation. We talk about the generations that have yet to find the way that they're calling themselves or the names that they're using. What do you tell people when you look at the generation of young people today and as they approach the role of business and their role in society? Is there anything about the youth generation today that makes them an impossible, if you will, generation, a generation that would embrace impossible more than others? And what should we understand about the youth of today as they look at charity, as they look at the idea about giving and thanks, and at the world as a whole?
I don't feel like I have the authority to speak for the youth generation. I don't know. But I feel very optimistic because I feel like so I'm 26 years old. The web was celebrated its 25th anniversary last week. And I feel like I've grown up alongside this like sibling, watching it like
Literally,
really change. Yeah.
It's your sibling.
And it's been quite phenomenal to see, like, not just how it itself has changed, but how it, in consequence, has changed our world. I think that like on a very subtle level, the social implications of things like social media, there's something like that's never been done historically. Like, you've never had one international kind of movement that's affected, a billion people in a moment, in a heartbeat. And I think that's what the potential of that structure is really in its infancy. And I think that, and there are many other things too, but I think that kind of affects my thinking when it comes to young people and what is made possible, because I think potentially it opens up the door to what is possible. And someone like me can have an idea and whisper it, in a way, into the world, and it might have an effect. And that could happen on many different levels, in many different ways. From somebody putting out an opinion or sharing a piece of art or sharing a piece of content to having an idea for a social network and trying to build it. And I'm very excited to see what that will spawn, and also just the attitude that might spawn of possibility.
Such a powerful use of words there, because 27 years ago or 26 years ago, a whisper campaign would have been something that you did subtly or secretly to influence people. And a whisper campaign in a social media world is open, which is remarkable. Thank you for bringing that perspective. I like that you said you can't speak with authority for them, because there are many constituencies, populations, people that are young today. But I'm going to ask you to take the general question and take it to a very personal level. I'd like you to tell me a story that surprised you about Impossible. Has there been one in particular instance where you've realized, oh, I never thought, even in my wildest dreams, that would happen, or I never realized that Impossible could help catalyze this? Tell us a story that surprised you.
I've had, to be honest, I don't get to hear enough of them, because I get people saying to me, like, peripherally, this, like, you know, I've met several people, or I've created this thing, or this has happened. And I think there must be so much going on that I'm unaware of, which is wonderful and also slightly annoying. I really wish I knew everything that's going on. There's been, most of them are very small, you know, that I know so far, and then that's beautiful. I don't say that as a bad thing. Like, that actually is what touches me, is like the smallness of these gestures and actually how much they therefore they mean, because it is surprising somewhat still when somebody is a stranger is doing something for you for no agenda, like for no reason, and there's something very powerful about that. And I've seen lots and lots of examples of that, and a real community forming within the network who understand that value proposition and are kind of creating relationships internationally. They've got people from Jordan to Mexico to Poland to Brazil, like, it's a really eclectic mix of people who've connected with the idea, connected with one another, and have kind of become early adopters. I would say the most interesting, powerful story for me has been actually the process of making it, because that continues, and that really is what has made it real, is the fact that it's been proving itself in its making. I really couldn't have done this by myself, like, I just couldn't, and I also might not have been inspired, like continually inspired to do it, but the fact that so many different people and organizations have said, I'll contribute this and I'll contribute that, and kind of given into something because they feel like it's bigger than themselves, that continually inspires me and has actually made it real and possible. So,
you know, speaking of that idea about making it, there's a question that came in as we prepared for our conversation, a question from the Twitter community asking a little bit about how one makes something happen in terms of finding the right people to help you build the technology, to do the back end. Something like this is a great concept, it's a great thing, and you said there needs to be a site to make it. Yeah, so tell us about that. What would you advise this person who tweeted in that question? Maybe she's thinking of doing something herself.
It's tough, yeah.
Tell us, what did you learn in that process?
So that for me was the hardest, because it's like doing something in Chinese and not speaking in China and not speaking Mandarin. You know, it's like I didn't speak code, I didn't speak that language, and that's a real challenge, I think. So maybe my first bit of advice actually would be to try and understand, even if you're not going to code it yourself, to actually try and understand that language a little bit better, because you're going to be working with people in that space, and even just to communicate with them and know how to deliver something is important. And then I'll explain my process with it. So I did 3 attempts to build it before I met the man who's become our kind of CTO. And that's actually a really beautiful story of gifting. That the first time I hired an individual, and I was like, I was still in university, I was still in Cambridge, so I didn't have time to work on it. And I was like, would you build this social network for me? And you can't ask an individual to build a social network that you haven't even designed yet. Like, that was just, number one, is not a good idea and didn't work. And several months later, after lots of frustration, I gave up on that idea. Then decided to hire an agency. That was just a waste of money, to be honest, and a waste of time. They were very well intentioned, but I feel like, and this would be my second piece of advice, you kind of need buy-in. Okay. There are examples where agencies do, I'm sure, deliver amazing work, but our project's so ongoing that we needed the development team to be people who I wasn't just paying for 6 months or a year to build something, but that in 2 years' time we're probably still going to be involved in the process. And so my third attempt from learning that was, okay, I need to find an investor or somebody who's actually bought into the idea, a bit more committed. And I met lots of different people, one of whom was a man called Kwame Ferreira, who's now kind of my partner in it. And he initially talked to me about the idea. He tried to do something similar about 5 years previous, and I think was very inspired by it. Then the next week I went to Bangladesh on that trip with Professor Yunus. And I'd been talking to him about him being an investor in Impossible. And I came back from Bangladesh, met him again to kind of continue that conversation, and then kind of mentioned at the end, by the way, I'm thinking about making a social business, which means you won't make any money, basically. Like, it subverts your motivation in what you're doing this for. And I said it lightly, like, you know, maybe I don't have to, like, if it's going to stop it being built, like, I obviously won't be able to do that. And extraordinarily, he came back to me and he said, I'm going to do this as a gift, because he'd been so affected by that idea that it made him even more determined to do it. That's not necessarily very helpful advice, because that's really specific to our story. But I guess from my learning in that process, I think, understand the code better, so you know the language you're speaking. If it's a long-term project, like if it's got a long-term, then potentially find partners and people who are going to be part of a team rather than outsourcing it. And if you do that, then essentially I would just say, like with anything technical or otherwise, find people who you get along with and who understand your vision. And then you're on the same journey together, and that becomes a really wonderful thing.
I think it's very specific and very good advice, and I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be following it. You know, if I may, we meet a lot of folks as we do work with the social good community, and we follow very much the community that believes in global engagement in this digital world. This generation that has had the internet as a sibling, the internet sibling generation. And so there are a lot of platforms and there are a lot of apps or technologies that are working for the greater good of the world, which is excellent. But as someone who just taught us about thanking, I'd like to call you out, Lily, because not often do we hear people talking about Kwame, the person who did bring resources and talent to build the back end. So it seems very on brand to me that you talk so openly in all of your materials in Impossible. We all feel like we know Kwame. I haven't met him yet, but I look forward to meeting him someday.
I had to drag him on stage once. He doesn't like to be.
Well, you bring him. You bring him anytime, because I have a feeling we have a lot to learn. But this idea about thanking and giving, which is something that I wanted to come back to. In the beginning of our conversation, you cited some of those findings out there, that people who give are happier, or that something happens with them. We at the UN Foundation have loved to watch the community of Giving Tuesday come together, this very global phenomenon that surprised perhaps some people and continues to delight everybody when we realize how global it is. You were part of Giving Tuesday in the UK as part of kind of the spontaneous movement building that has been happening. So I'd love to know a little bit about that experience, but even more specifically, are people who give, people like the Giving Tuesday community who just want to give back, are they really happier? And if people don't realize that, what can they learn from people who are giving today?
So yes, and science actually shows it. Oxytocin, dopamine are released when you give, so you're chemically actually, it makes you happier. And I think that also like for me, life is relationships. Like a huge part of the value I derive from my life is in my relationships with the people around me, friends, family, but also people. And usually if you're more generous, people around you are more generous back. Like I feel like it's often quite mirrored, these relationships. And so inevitably that makes you happier. Like you feel more connected to the world around you, and it's a happier experience. And I'd also say that every time someone gives, someone receives. And so I actually started calling at one point Impossible the giving and receiving culture, because it's not just about giving, it's also about receiving. And if everybody's doing both, you're inevitably going to experience both. And I think I want to receive as much as I want to give. You know, like I think they're actually both really important.
If no one's receiving, you can't give.
Yeah,
that part of it as well.
And to receive is also to give in a funny way, you know, because you're giving someone else the opportunity to give, and you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to receive. And if you just think about the math of it, if everybody in this room was giving and receiving, we would all give and receive. You know, so it's never a one-way stream. So yeah, I do vote that that's a good way of being with one another. And I would hope that at some point we don't even need to call it giving and receiving, and it just like is just natural behavior. It's just like a way things flow that are not so transactional, essentially.
Good advice in Washington, D.C., by the way. I think maybe you should stay here for a while. I think there's a lot of people who need to hear about that relationship. So I threw out there Giving Tuesday, and we saw it here in the U.S. and globally, but you saw it in the U.K. Tell us about that. It sounded like people were experiencing more happiness because they were giving, but tell us about how something like that resonates in the UK.
So the way I came into contact with Giving Tuesday was that Jimmy, who works with us, he said, wouldn't it be really fun if we just ran around London for the day fulfilling wishes? And he's like, there's this thing Giving Tuesday, maybe we can do it on that day. I think it was the beginning of December last year. And so we both set out a day in our calendar that was devoted to just running around London, answering as many wishes as possible. We like posted on Impossible, we posted on Twitter, that anybody who was wishing that day, we would try and fulfill. And I think we managed to do about 6. I mean, we were driving to different places. And as kind of per the conversation just before, like I had the most fun ever. Like I'm the one giving, but like you're just essentially connecting with human beings. You're not, you know, like that's where the value comes. It's like you're meeting interesting people, you know, and you're like having conversations that you wouldn't necessarily have. And that moment in time is really valuable. So yeah, that was our experience of Giving Tuesday.
A very offline
Yeah, very
experience
offline,
for
yeah.
something that was also very online, and that blend seems to be coming through and impossible with all of the things that we're hearing. A final question to you, as someone who is a supermodel and a role model. So there are girls around the world, there are young people around the world that are looking at you and your career, and they're thinking, gosh, she's doing something I want to do. We at the UN Foundation believe very much in the power of what the young generation teaches us, and in particular about what happens when you put out the truth that a girl can change the world. I'd love to know, when those 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 10-year-old girls meet you, what do you tell them about a career or advice or about changing the world? Is there something that you've been able to tell a 10-year-old Lily Cole, or an advice that you would give an up-and-coming girl that wants to follow in your footsteps? What do you tell her?
It's challenging because you can never fit it into a nutshell, can you? But I was with a 5-year-old last week for a few hours, and I felt suddenly very maternal, and I just talked to her about, random stuff like you do with a 5-year-old. I'm not going to try and give her wisdom, but
she wanted to give you wisdom, I'm sure.
but I asked her about actually what she wanted to do, and just asked her questions that just tried to probe her, imagination. And I think my main impetus when I'm speaking to somebody that young is really to want them to realize how much is possible, and to see that if not anything is possible, nearly anything is possible when you put your heart and mind to it. And we talked before about limitations and the limitations we can apply, and sometimes they are because of gender, or sometimes they're because of race, or sometimes they're because of culture, or many different reasons might make us think it's more difficult to achieve something. And I would say the same to a 5-year-old boy. I would just want to instill an idea that if they follow their heart and put their mind to something, they can achieve pretty much anything.
It's good advice from a role model and someone that's impacting a lot of people around the world. We're here at the UN Foundation, so I would be remiss if I did not pose in kind of one of our final moments here. The UN is working on the biggest global issues of our time, and there's a long list, a to-do list of things that we need to, as people on this earth, and people who give, and people who care about the next generation, to make sure that we're leaving the world a better place and creating a better world. What are the things on your mind if you ever are up in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., one of those moments? Chances are you're on a plane at 2 a.m. But what are the things that are the big global issues right now that worry you, or that are ones that you say, gosh, if we just could be focusing on X, we could be making some progress? Is there a global issue that captures your attention or grabs your attention the most, Lily?
I spent a few years looking at different, working different charities and looking at different issues, because I was always compelled by all of them and wanted to try and work out where to focus my energy, and came increasingly to the belief, which I still hold in, that the environment to me is really important, because I think that if we kind of don't deal with or wake up to or deal with in time that issue, the ramifications also humanitarianly, also to do with animal, all the other issues that we have today will just be exemplified. That's the baseline. We need that to survive. And I really love the Earth. I really genuinely do.
It's a nice planet.
We're very lucky. Yeah. It's a very hospitable planet. So yeah, that to me is probably the biggest internal driver. But I think that the way that manifests, how we can actually think about that and many other issues, sometimes are much more subtle than just me trying to fly less or use less bottled water or turn my lights off. I also think they're affected by cultural ideas of value. So I think there's a subtle but underlying environmental agenda with Impossible, even, that it's a proposition of value that's maybe less consumption orientated, that you can that's more about time and experiences and sharing. And I think there are many different ways we can tackle that. And I think a lot of that to do is to do with culture and cultural ideas of value and how we interact with one another and interact with the world. So yeah, environment, and then the other thing I would say is economics, and that's why I use, whether it's the gift economy or also looking at production chains and monetary economies, which I've done quite a lot through fashion, I really see economics as having such a huge impact on our world right now that unless we look to those structures, we will always have the need for charity, we'll always have the need to deal with problems caused often in the production chains themselves. So that's where I kind of focus my energy.
These are big issues, and in a year when everyone's talking about climate change, I was happy to hear you talk about solutions, because it sounds like Impossible is a way to bring some of those solutions together and to bring them home.
Yeah, but it's not trying to solve, it's like we can't do everything in one platform, but if we do lots of these different things, and if we just question our own, I think, ideas of value and question our own decisions every day and our own ideas of what is possible every day, then collectively maybe we can achieve a lot more.
Well, Lily, you've posed that question to me, to all of us here in the room at the UN Foundation, what is possible? You've reiterated and underlined what we already knew about from your career, that there's very little is impossible when we come together and give and receive and have that spirit of thankfulness and thoughtfulness in what we do. In a world that's got some very big issues, we're really lucky that we've got great allies and creative thinkers like you, Lily. So thank you for being with us today.
I feel very embarrassed, but thank you.
Thank you.